This is a subject matter that I am very, very passionate about. I grew up the minority in my neighborhood and in my schools, so I know what it's like to be hated for the color of my skin. Nothing what the majority of individuals in our country have dealt with, for sure. But I remember being on panels and being part of discussions in elementary school about diversity and loving each other and accepting each other. And when I became a journalist, I knew that this was a subject matter. This was something I was passionate about, that I wanted to take advantage of as a journalist to talk more about. So the sad part about my job is that I'm having to cover mass tragedies and shootings and murders because people hate. But the positive side of my job is that I can use what I do as a platform to be at summits like this and have discussions like this. And when the shooting happened at the synagogue, I actually raised my hand and said, hey, I would love to do an in-depth piece for Nightline now that I'm at ABC. And I have the perfect person I can interview. He's a reformed neo-Nazi. And everybody looked at me and went, what? And I said, yes. I said, this is someone who hated so deeply, but he is so inspiring because now he loves so deeply, and he has a story to tell about his life and why he made that change and why he's dedicating his entire life now to take those who hate and turn them into individuals who love. And one thing that he said to me that always sticks in my mind is, Kyra, I never hated anybody. The only person I hated was myself. And it took me a while to figure that out. So, if you don't mind, I would love to start this discussion because you have all been there on the ground and within the communities, whether it's Erika as a leader in your community, Chief as the police chief, Jeremy, you're sent to all situations to try and help the community to heal and get past these horrible tragedies. In your opinion, each one of you, we'll start with you, Jeremy. Why do you think people hate?
It's such the root of the question that really sort of, because we want to think now, like, how do we heal? But where does it come from and why do people hate? It just reminds me so deeply of my first day in Pittsburgh when I got there on Sunday morning. And I'm walking near the synagogue, near the Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill. And I overheard a conversation with the mom and probably her 4-year-old son. And the 4-year-old boy turned to the mom and said, Mommy, is that the place, pointing to Tree of Life Synagogue, where all those people were killed yesterday just because they went to synagogue? And the mom turned silent. She had nothing to say because it was the boy, the 4-year-old, was the grown-up in the room in that conversation. He was exactly right. It's the room, it's the place, that was the building where 11 people were killed simply because they went to synagogue on a Saturday morning and they were Jewish. And to get to the bottom of why someone hates that much, as I was watching that conversation take place, all I could think about was, I have a 2-year-old at home, thinking that he wasn't old enough to ask that same question. Because I don't think at times like that, when there's a tragedy that deep, that the words or an answer is ever really there in a profound way that can create some reason why someone walks in to a synagogue, to a church, to a nightclub, and tears down everything that we try to build. So why does it happen? Or what can we do to pick up the pieces and try to ensure that it won't happen again?
Erika, as a leader in politics in the community, what have you found when it comes to hate?
Well, it's such a profound question. I mean, and such a basic question at the same time. For me, it comes down to a fear of the other and, a lack of exposure to what some might perceive as the other. In Robert Bowers, the Pittsburgh shooters case, and I have to say, I live 3 blocks from the synagogue. I live in Squirrel Hill. I live 3 blocks from the synagogue where this atrocity took place. This is my neighborhood. And so it's an incredibly difficult question to wrap my mind around because You know, in a neighborhood like Squirrel Hill, just to paint a picture a little bit, one of the most inclusive communities I've ever lived in, where there are yard signs that say, no matter who you, in 3 different languages, no matter who you are, we're glad you're our neighbor. It was Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, quite literally. He lived down the street from me when he was alive. You know, to have hate hit home in such an inclusive and such a multi-ethnic and multicultural community was unfathomable until that day. And we know that Robert Bowers was not only an anti-Semite, he was xenophobic. He had a major fear of immigrants and refugees coming into the community and to his country. And you know, it brings me back to the popular quote, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like a burden. To me, that's where he was, and it was the worst kind of confluence of a person who perhaps, like the person you followed and tracked, the reformed white nationalist who had self-loathing and a lack of empathy, and who knows what happened in his life to cause that, combined with the cultural war that we're fighting in this country right now, and combined with you know, the ability to find like-minded others, even if you're secluded in your own home, online. So it was the worst kind of confluence that I think led to an action like this in Pittsburgh.
And we're going to talk about the impact of social media. I think that's a very important discussion to have, because we've watched that it impact what we're seeing tremendously. Luther, for you as a law enforcement officer, what have you learned by just working in so many different communities when it comes to why people hate?
I think it's important just to even state out loud that hate exists. I think it's important to acknowledge that. There's bullies. I think a lot of people are taught hate. I think the antithesis almost of hate is a lack of love. I think it's generational. I think there's a deep history in our country, and it's very real, and it's something that I think the ADL has done a fantastic job. Just a credit to the ADL. I've been a beneficiary of David Friedman and Elise Jarvis and others in my career to be brought through the Holocaust Museum, to understand very deeply, to actually visit Israel. I just returned from there. And I think hate is a lack of awareness, a lack of education, and it's driven by a lot of different things, and it's very real.
So, Erika, when we saw what happened in your community, and members of your community came up to you and said, and looked to you as their leader and said, why us? Why did this happen? We're about love, we're about community, we all get along. I mean, you mentioned the signs that people have up in their yards. What do you say to them? What did you say to them?
It's impossible to rationalize an irrational act, and clearly it was a person who was not acting rationally. It's almost an impossible question to answer, because you can't put your mind into someone else's mind who is thinking and behaving like that. Other questions that came up: why then? Why that synagogue? Why right when services were starting and not perhaps 20, 30 minutes later, when there could have been, God forbid, even more atrocities, more people present? It's one of those questions you really can't answer yourself as a human being, but what we do know is that hate, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, fear of the other is alive and well. But as I've said so many times this last month, we've seen the worst of humanity in Pittsburgh and in Squirrel Hill, and then far overshadowing that, the best of humanity and the best of what people can be in their response, not just in Pittsburgh and not just in Squirrel Hill, but truly from all over the world.
And Jeremy, when these type of tragedies happen, your job is to get on the ground, go there, and help the healing process. How do you even start that? How do you even begin? What do you say to those that come up to you and just say they need to be heard, they need some sort of explanation?
You know, it's an old teacher of mine once told me that in times of crisis, when things go wrong, Sometimes what you got to do is you just show up. And for us, for ADL and my role, the Cleveland region, which covers Pittsburgh, and I know so many of my colleagues across the country, we weren't going to fix the problem on Saturday night or Sunday. Sure, our experts had resources and briefings out to law enforcement agents and on the killer and more and more and more. What can we do? What do the people do? People just need a hug. They need to hear that we're with you. And as Senator Booker said earlier this morning, I see you, I love you. So for me, Saturday night, the second that the Shabbat, that the Sabbath ended, I got in a car and I got as close to Pittsburgh as I could. So my dad's from Pittsburgh, and most of the time when I drive into Pittsburgh, it's for a Steelers game. And as Erika knows, when you try to drive and get a hotel room on a Saturday night in Pittsburgh when there's a home game on Sunday, you don't get very far. I made it as close as Weirton, West Virginia, before I had to stop and say, please, do you have a room? I got the last one. And on Sunday morning, as quickly as I could, I just went there. And I went to the synagogue, and that's what we do all across the country, because at a time when there's something like this, when something this tragic happens, we're not going to explain it right away. But what we can do is we can be present. And it's so important to be present, to be there, and to give the people who are grieving what they need at moments like that.
Luther, you're the police chief in Charleston, and I, along with many others, covered the mass shooting at Mother Emanuel Church, and Dylan Roof, who all he wanted to do was kill black people. That's what he said his goal was, and he went and he did that. You were not there at that time, but you have come to a community that's still healing from that. Your job is to not only protect those in the community, but also it's a very faithful community, as is yours, Erika. So you have sort of a dual mission. And Mother Emanuel has had a history of violence, but survival. I remember the historian of the church telling me members were lynched and our church was burned down, but we didn't give up. We kept fighting. We weren't going to leave. We were going to rebuild. We were still going to have our congregation here. So how do you keep that strong spirit going in your community after decades of hate crimes and tragedies?
So I think the city of Charleston, the community, the African American community, the AME Church, the local leaders, I think not unlike the Jewish community, have a quiet resolve, a strength, a vision, a hope for the future, a sense of clarity of what's right and wrong. And they, thankfully, did not get lost in the hate act. And they looked at that, and his intent was to divide the city, to create a race war, in essence. He killed 9 beautiful, innocent people who were engaged in a Bible study. And they said, at some point, they hit the pause button, and they said, time out. We don't want people to come into our city and destroy the city and let this divide us. We want to be united. We want to stand in solidarity as brothers and sisters of all faiths. We want to stand before God, and we want to make a difference. And when we evolve and we emerge, and as we grow through this terrible tragedy, which the city of Charleston will never forget, as same thing with Pittsburgh. But as we heal and as we grow, and there were survivors that were involved in that to this day are very active, we want to be stronger. We want to have a greater sense of clarity and love and commitment to each other. And to me, it was amazing to see, and I think for the whole world to see, and that same kind of quiet strength exists today. And I will tell you, in law enforcement, there's a history with the African American community in the city of Charleston. There's a history of slavery. There's all kinds of really dark histories, and the police don't always fall on the right side of that. And when I go to the African American churches, in particular the AME churches, I would say they're the ones that welcome me more than anybody. The ones that probably should keep me at arm's length, maybe have the greatest reason for distrust, are the ones that embrace me the most and are the most welcoming. So it takes time, it takes a process, but it takes a resolve, it takes a vision, and it takes, I think, a lot of clarity to get through such a terrible, painful event.
And social media, I have found by in-depth pieces that I've done and documentaries on hate, it's absolutely incredible how much social media impacts these mass tragedies. It brings haters all together, and they inspire each other to go outside of the depths of their basement or the privacy of their home and into the world and commit these horrible acts of violence. Your views on social media, what we can all do personally and as a community and as a country, because it's a tremendous challenge. And I will say, Erika, you mentioned too, social media can also be a really beautiful thing. People galvanize and they raise money for victims and they put out inspiring videos that go viral. So there's a beautiful thing about it as well. But it also is contributing to these acts of violence that we're seeing. Your feelings about social media and what we can do. Jeremy.
We have a lot of work to do with social media, and I know ADL obviously is deep in the trenches in terms of being able to monitor the activity that takes place. But I want to pick up on the second point you made and a point that Erika made earlier too. When I was driving to Pittsburgh on that Saturday night, by the time I got to Weirton, West Virginia, didn't make it to Pittsburgh, as you know.
The last room.
Exactly. I had about 15 emails when I got there of activists from across the country, not just my region in Ohio and West Virginia, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania, but across the country who said, hey, here's a link to something, have you seen this yet? And what they were sending me was, in a rural town in Ohio on that Saturday evening, there was a Saturday night swastika costume party. And it was still going on that same Saturday that the Pittsburgh massacre occurred. And apparently, from the social media posts that I saw and from the emails that I received about it, this has been a tradition in rural Ohio at the same location dating back 20, 30 years. And I had never heard of it before. And I asked my colleague who had been in the position prior to me, hey, have you ever heard of this? She said, no one's ever told me about this. So what I saw was, yes, I mean, it's horrendous that something like that even still takes place, and even more so that it was still taking place on the evening that everything happened in Pittsburgh. But people felt compelled, and they felt motivated, and they felt a real cause to say, hey, this is happening, what can we do? And that's what every email ended with. I know this is happening, I want to let you know, what can I do to help? So I think social media is an area where, yes, we need to track and we need to know, and we need to be at the forefront of technology and intelligence to know who's out there and know what they're saying, but it also is a place that we can use to galvanize those to help us combat that. And that's what I was most encouraged by on one of the darkest days that I have ever lived. So.
Erika.
It's a tough one because, as has been said, it can be a force for good, like any technology. It's the way that, the Victims Fund has raised more than $5 million, and the Muslim community alone has raised over $1 million right away for this fund, for this effort. It's the way that Pittsburghers felt the entire world giving them a hug, a virtual hug, because we felt that there were Shabbat services, there was Show Up to Shabbat, the hashtag. There were standing in solidarity with Pittsburgh. There were just countless acts of kindness directed at the people of Pittsburgh and Squirrel Hill in particular. And that was amazing. But it's also a place, it's also like any new technology that can be used for evil. And in this case, it has been. It's, the peril of social media is that, as has been mentioned, I think, throughout the day here, and something we talk about a lot, it's difficult to find differing opinions on social media. You find the people and you find the echo chamber that you want to be in. And so in the case of people who are hate-filled, they will find and perpetrate often misinformation in an echo chamber that just continues and spirals out of control, and there's no one there. There's no one there to calibrate it, to offer a differing opinion. And for certain people, then it puts them over the edge, and they want to take action. Terrible, horrific action like we saw in Pittsburgh. So that's the danger. It reminds me of any new technology like the advent of the automobile, when it was sort of the Wild West and we didn't have many traffic laws and there weren't seatbelts, and what did we do? Well, I'm a legislator. We passed legislation and we tried to regulate it. So in my mind, whether it's self-regulation or federal action or local action that we need to take to regulate the bad parts of it, that's what needs to happen here.
Perfect segue to you, Chief, when talking about taking action and legislation. Will you share with the group what you've been working on and what you've accomplished?
Sure. So just generally, I'll segue from that question into a hate crime ordinance that we've passed. It's up for its third reading. It passed unanimously in the city of Charleston, and we're kind of pushing that conversation to the state. We're one of 5 states in the country that does not currently have a hate crime ordinance. So to me, it's important. My favorite quote from the Holocaust Museum in DC is, "Evil prevails when good men remain silent." Why do I say that in the context of this conversation? As leaders, in my position, I'll speak as a police chief of Charleston, I have a certain amount of influence. As a parent, as a community member, as a neighbor, I have a voice. This is not a passive issue. This is not a gray area. I have total clarity in my stand against hate. I need to voice that. We voiced that through this ordinance. We voiced that through discussions in city council. As often and as frequently as I can voice that, I think it's important that I do that. That there's no space between me and my brothers and sisters in the Jewish community, in the African American community, in the LGBTQ community, in any communities where there's bullying, I'll call it, where there's hate. And I think that even our children, my kids are grown up now, but we used to have this conversation. If there's somebody in the lunchroom that's being picked on, you don't just kind of not participate. You engage. You're active. You have a role to make sure that you protect those other kids, that you sit with them at lunchtime. It's almost similar in the sense that as leaders, we need to be vocal. We need to be assertive. We need to use our voice and our influence. So we've done that with this hate crimes ordinance. And I've been asked, did you get a lot of pushback? Was there a lot of resistance? And the answer is no. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't people out there that don't agree, that don't think that we should have an ordinance. But I can tell you that we have been very clear in our arguments that people are being victimized, that that's something that needs to be tracked and documented, that it's something that we should be talking about, that we need to play a very active role in. And I can tell you it's been very, very well received. And timing is everything. Maybe now the call for clarity because of what happened in Pittsburgh and that terrible tragedy, part of the good that can come from that is that we do something different, that we do more, that we have an assertive role in leading through this topic of hate, and that it exists in our communities, acknowledging it, naming it, and dealing with it as much as we can, as often and as specifically as we can.
I'm going to go a little rogue for a minute, and I hope I don't get in trouble for this, but while we're having this discussion and we have these distinguished members of the panel, by chance, does anybody have a question for either Erika or Luther or Jeremy? I would love to. Yes, just stand up and shout out your question, please.
The party?
Say it again. Could you repeat the question?
No, the question is, knowing about that party in Ohio, what have we done about it? Now,
Thank you.
Thank you. So what was the first thing we did was we got in touch with our local law enforcement chapters and the local police department, and also our contacts at the FBI and various intelligence agencies, just to make sure that they were aware of it as well. But the real question is, what can you do to stop something like that from happening year after year after year? And it starts with education. It starts with getting people to a place where they understand where that hate comes from, why it's so offensive to so many people, because the truth of the matter is that many people who attended that party probably didn't know. They probably didn't even know how hurtful they were being and how hateful they were being to the entirety of the community. And there's no place for that ignorance, and there's no place for that lack of education. So what do? We do what we know how to do. We educate people, we work with our partners in the law enforcement community, we work with our partners in the legislation, and we bring together a multi-pronged approach to ensure that we start preventing it year over year over year. That evening, lost cause. The future, that's what this is all about today. That's what coming together to actually say never is now means. And that's what our office did, and I know that's what my colleagues across the country do, and we speak out. We use our words, we use our voices to let people know it's not okay.
Another question possibly from the group. And don't be shy. Okay, well, oh yes, please, stand up. Speak as loudly as you can.
What can I, as an individual, do besides running? What is the role of someone who would like to do something to help this or happen? What can we do?
You know, that's a great question, and maybe all three of you can answer that. What can I do as an individual? Just in my daily life, in my community, what can I do? I'm sure all three of you have ideas. Go ahead, Chief.
I would just reiterate to some degree what I just said. I don't think it matters how old you are, if you're a senior, if you're a young person. I think young kids in elementary school have a huge role in this conversation, right? Because there's bullies in the schools, and if you want to see a different side of me, put me in front of a bully type person, and there's a whole different person that comes out. And frankly, I think there is some room for righteous anger on this topic from all of us, right? And so I think when you're playing cards, when you're at the synagogue, when you're talking to your neighbors, this is something that is extremely important for all of us to have total clarity on. When there's a legislative issue that comes up, the ADL is phenomenal. You should give yourselves a tremendous amount of credit, not just for the Jewish community, but for the whole topic of hate throughout our country. There's a whole section of the ADL that does a lot to educate law enforcement so that we can be better advocates. When we created this ordinance, the ADL helped us with the language and met with our legal staff and helped us follow up. And there's other cities in Charleston now and in the state of South Carolina. So I think it's a conversation. I think it's ongoing, and we can't have that with confidence and clarity unless we're educated ourselves, unless we're willing to get out of our comfort zone, unless we develop experiences and empathy with and for others. So it takes work being a good leader. It takes work being a good advocate. I don't think that ever ends until one day, for me, I go to heaven, right? And so I have a lot of work to do. I've been to Israel twice. I've done a lot of different things, and the more that I learn, I tell people the more I know that I need to learn. I don't think it ever ends. Everybody in this room, every one of your children, every one of your colleagues, every one of your neighbors, every one of the people in different regions that aren't here today has influence and can have an impact, a significant impact on this topic.
Erika.
Well, and I'll take this opportunity to say what I plan on doing, and how others in my community or outside of the community can help. And it's a few different things. One is, right after a tragedy is almost the easiest time to find unity. Now is when the real work begins, right? A little bit over a month afterwards. In the midst of a tragedy, people come together, and it's easy to find common ground and forget our differences. And so it behooves us all to work to keep that unity as much as possible, not only in the already very tight-knit Jewish community in Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh, but also, we were able to do so much of what we did and respond the way we did with the ADL's help, the local JCC, the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh, Jewish Family and Community Services, all working together to respond to one another, to bring everyone together, and multi kind of ethnic and inter faith community coming together. Now already there are external forces trying to divide us. There are people claiming online that the money raised by the Muslim community is not actually going to go to the fund, and that's completely false and already has been called out online 50-fold, against that proposition, that ridiculous proposition. So we need to keep the unity as much as possible. We need to, I think, do the foundational bridge building across demographic and across geographic lines. So while Squirrel Hill is a really special place, we need to work to expand that sort of feeling outside, that sort of the special aspect of it, the welcoming aspect of it outside of our own little neighborhood. Understand that neighbors in areas of the city that might have been traditionally disenfranchised, underserved, those are our neighbors too. Have those cups of coffee, start to talk with people there, and do the foundational bridge building so that we can demonstrate we're your allies. We understand that that our destinies are linked, and until you thrive, none of us thrive. And that we can demonstrate that we're there for them in the way that they were there for us. And that's something that not only leaders can do, it's something everyone can do, to do that, have those hard conversations, but really say, what are your goals? What are your dreams? How can we help each other? And so if something does happen in the future, we can be there for each other. And expand that outside of Pittsburgh too. You drive 30 minutes outside of Pittsburgh, and there are more cultural differences than there are within Pittsburgh. And so, how do we expand it outside of Pittsburgh as well, and outside of our own kind of backyard? And then the third thing is ensuring that our leaders are, whether they're public safety leaders, whether they're legislative leaders, political leaders, faith leaders, leave no room for hate anywhere. There's no room for hate, and speak that unequivocally. And if they're not, then hold them accountable. Vote them out of office, or find another way to hold them accountable. Organize your fellow residents and community members to do that. So I think those are 3 different ways that leaders and everyone can be involved in this.
And I want to give, I know I'm seeing the please wrap, but please let Jeremy give quick final thoughts if you don't mind. I don't want to get in too much trouble, so keep it short. It's the ADL saying please wrap on the screen, so you have to keep it short and powerful and meaningful.
Oh, they won't get mad at me. I'm fine. Don't worry.
They won't fire Jeremy.
When when you asked the question, it reminded me when I was a counselor at Camp Vermont, Canada, when I was 20 years old, and during the most impactful summers, or really anything in my life, my supervisor used to say to me, my Rosh Hashanah used to say to me, "You have the choice today to make a difference in someone's life." And that's how he started every day at a staff meeting. Everyone here made the choice to show up today. And when you leave, hopefully you'll take the messages that you heard not just from this panel, but from the plenaries and every breakout that you went to, and take that to fuel you to continue making those choices. So on behalf of my colleagues, I'm allowed to say thank you for making the choice to being here, but more importantly, I just want to say thank you for making the choices I know you'll make when you leave the room tonight. So.
And just one final thought, and it was triggered by something that you said about not keeping silent, and Erika, conversation, and you also, Jeremy, answering this beautiful woman's question about being involved. I talk to my kids about everything. I talk to them about horrible people. I talk to them about really good people, and they're only 7 years old. And I have had parents come up to me and say, "Were you just talking about the Holocaust? Were you just talking about the Donald Trump and Michael Cohen? Were you just talking about?" And I said, yes. I do talk to my kids about those things because they are real and they are happening. And in my opinion, I feel that being ignorant and being uneducated and not understanding the way the world works, and that means good and evil, that I'm not doing a good job as a mom. So my advice is, as going through all this and covering these stories, talk to your kids, talk to your grandkids, talk to your neighbors' kids, be open and honest about the conversation, because that truly is the only way we're going to heal and move forward and raise fabulous young people, right, to make a difference in this world. Thank you all so much for your time. Thank you.